Reflecting on my past, I can distinctly trace the divide between the chapters of my life to a specific moment. At 15, during a quiet evening in our modest living room, my parents shared that they were divorcing. There was no turmoil or raised voices, just three people who had drifted apart, each desiring different paths in life. Surprisingly, I accepted the news with a calm that might have stemmed from their mature approach, or perhaps I had anticipated the change, observing signs like the decrease in family dinners and their coexistence more as roommates than spouses. My father relocated to a pleasant apartment across town, and our weekends together remained unchanged, filled with pizza and cheesy sci-fi films. However, a year post-divorce, my mother introduced a significant change. She was elated one morning, telling me over breakfast about meeting someone named Gabriel, who had a 9-year-old daughter. The idea of gaining a sister seemed nice in theory, but the reality unfolded differently. Gabriel and his daughter, Amara, moved in soon after he and my mother married. Amara, always dressed impeccably and sweetly in the presence of adults, revealed a different side in their absence. Subtle sabotages began. My favorite sweater ruined by red socks in the wash, coffee stains mysteriously appearing on my homework. Gabriel's subtle digs didn't help, critiquing my clothing choices and insinuating I should focus more on my studies. My attempts to discuss these issues with my mother were dismissed. She believed Gabriel was merely being protective. The tipping point came with the research project incident. I had invested weeks gathering data and conducting interviews for it. Coming home early one day, I caught Amara in my room, her hands stained green from the markers she'd used to deface my project. Enraged, I dragged her to confront our parents. As I pointed out the evidence, Gabriel vehemently defended his daughter and scolded me, calling me a fool. I turned to my mother for support, but she offered none, only disappointment directed at me. That night, unable to sleep and tormented by the day's events, I resolved to leave. By dawn, I was hastily packing my belongings. I called my dad, and within minutes, he was ready to pick me up. As I loaded my bags into his truck, my mother watched from the doorway, pleading with me not to overreact. Facing her one last time, I expressed my hurt over her indifference and the destruction of my work. Her silence spoke volumes, confirming my decision as I left to start a new chapter with my father. After I shared the incident with my dad, I could see his demeanor change instantly. When I told him about Gabriel's disrespectful words, he was furious and headed straight to Gabriel's office to confront him. I waited in the truck, watching from a distance as my dad stormed into the building. Through the office window, I saw them. My dad pointing forcefully and Gabriel rising to meet his accusations, both red-faced and agitated. Security had to intervene before the situation escalated further. Life at my dad's place was a breath of fresh air. It felt like coming up for air after being submerged. The constant tension and paranoia I had lived with at my mom's house were gone. My dad supported me wholeheartedly, helping me redo my ruined research project with late-night sessions accompanied by coffee and snacks. A few days later, my mom sent me a message accusing me of turning my father against Gabriel and tearing our family apart. I didn't respond. What family was she referring to? One where I was verbally abused and my belongings destroyed? I chose to focus on finishing my senior year strong. At graduation, my dad and grandma were there in the front row, cheering loudly. My mom attended too, with Gabriel and Amara, but I hardly acknowledged them. Afterward, my grandma hugged me tightly, sharing that she and my dad had been saving for my college fund, which would cover my tuition at a local college. Moving into the dorms that fall marked a new chapter. A few months into my sophomore year, my mom reached out via social media, expressing remorse and a desire to talk. We met at a cafe near campus, and it was awkward at first, with both of us stirring our coffee too long and avoiding eye contact. Mom mentioned Amara looking at colleges and Gabriel's new car, but I steered the conversation towards safer topics like my classes and potential graduate school plans. Our relationship evolved into monthly coffee meetings where we discussed neutral topics like the weather and my studies. Though she occasionally tried to bring up Gabriel and Amara, I would gently redirect our conversations. After graduation, I secured a job at Marshall & Associates as a junior project manager. My dad was thrilled and offered me a place in his apartment to save money, but I decided it was time to stand on my own. I found a modest apartment close to work. The first night there, eating takeout on a secondhand couch, I felt a profound sense of adulthood. I was diligent with my finances, saving a significant portion of my paycheck for future house fund, and opting for homemade lunches over expensive outings with colleagues. When a challenging client came up at work, everyone hesitated, but I stepped up. 5 months later, I had successfully managed the project ahead of schedule, earning a commendation and a bonus from my impressed boss. As the quarterly bonuses began to stack up, each one substantial, I diligently directed every dime into my savings. My colleagues often joked about my frugality, questioning why I skipped the after-work gatherings and weekend getaways. "You're wasting your youth," my mom echoed during one of our routine coffee catch-ups, about 3 years into my disciplined savings plan. "You should enjoy life a bit more." "I am enjoying life," I responded firmly. "I'm building my future." She stirred her coffee distractedly, shifting the topic to Amara, who was thriving in college and had just joined a sorority. I steered the conversation back to safer grounds, mentioning the recent pleasant weather. Family events like Thanksgiving at Aunt Margot's or Christmas at Uncle Samuel's were the few occasions where avoiding Gabriel and Amara became challenging. Amara, now more poised and attending college, still shot me those smug looks, her bratty demeanor polished but palpable. Gabriel, always ready with a condescending remark, would make snide comments about my job, loudly noting my entry-level position, despite knowing full well about my promotions. Last Thanksgiving, as I helped Aunt Margot in the kitchen, my mom cornered me by the refrigerator. "Bella, don't you think this has gone on long enough?" she sighed. "Amara's grown up, Gabriel's mellowed. Can't we just be a families?" I shut the fridge with more force than necessary. "We're not a family, Mom. We're just connected by your marriage. That's it." Her expression shifted to one of exasperation. "You're being childish," she accused. I met her gaze directly. People grow, people change. I've grown enough to know I don't need toxic people in my life, even if they're technically family. She opened her mouth to counter, then simply shook her head and walked away, always opting to avoid confrontation. Each dismissive comment from Gabriel and each arrogant glance from Amara only affirmed my decision to maintain distance. On my 30th birthday, the years of scrimping paid off as I signed the papers for my new house, putting down 70% up front. The mortgage was manageable, a minor detail in my well-planned future. "Congratulations, Miss Parker," the realtor beamed, handing me the keys to what was now my home. I stood in the empty living room, soaking in the reality of my achievement: 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, granite kitchen counters, and a backyard begging for a garden. It was all undeniably mine. Planning a housewarming, I invited close friends and family, though Dad and Grandma, now enjoying retirement in Los Angeles, couldn't attend. When I called Mom, I specified, "I'd love for you to come, just you." She hesitated. "Bella, that's not fair to Gabriel and Amara." "It's my house, my rules," I insisted. Reluctantly, she agreed. Yet, on the day, I opened my door to find not just my mother but also Gabriel and Amara in tow. "Surprise," Mom offered weakly at my evident dismay. I held back my frustration and welcomed them in. Gabriel surveyed my home, his lips curling subtly as he remarked on the crown molding and hardwood floors, his approval faint and begrudging. Amara, ever the fashionista, commented dismissively on the kitchen size. As I led my colleague Micah to show the patio, I felt a mix of pride and irritation. My space, my sanctuary, was open for this day, but my boundaries remained as firm as the walls of my new home. As I mingled with my guests, a loud voice from the living room caught my attention. It was Amara, boasting to her parents. "I've been looking at houses too," she announced. "I'm going to get one much bigger than this, with a pool." I couldn't resist responding, so I stepped back into the living room. "Really? That's interesting. What job are you planning to buy it with?" Her face turned red as she struggled for an answer. "I have prospects," she managed to mumble. "Prospects aren't paychecks," I countered, recalling that she was still heavily reliant on her father's credit card. At this, Gabriel's face flushed a deep purple, and he began, "How dare you?" "No. How dare you?" I interrupted, standing my ground firmly. "You show up uninvited, then insult my homes." My mother, sensing the tension escalating, quickly grabbed Gabriel's arm. "Come on, Gabriel, Amara, we're leaving," she said, pulling them toward the door. As they left, Mom gave me a regretful look over her shoulder before they disappeared. 5 months after the housewarming debacle, a significant opportunity arose at work, a major project in New York that could catapult my career into senior management. However, my main concern was my home, especially my indoor garden. I had painstakingly cultivated a collection of plants, including delicate orchids, temperamental peace lilies, and a recently blooming rare bird of paradise. Each required specific care, and the thought of them perishing in my absence was distressing. After much consideration, I decided to ask for help. I drove to my mom's house. We hadn't spoken much since the party. Surprised to see me, she opened the door. "Bella, is everything okay?" "I need a favor," I began as we walked into her kitchen. "I'm heading to New York for a few months for work. Could you look after my house? Mainly the plants. They need regular watering and care." Her face brightened at the mention of gardening. "Of course. You know I love gardening." Relieved, I handed her the spare keys along with detailed instructions for each plant. The next few months were grueling yet fulfilling. I managed a team across various time zones, working 14-hour days. Despite the intensity of the project, I made time to call Mom weekly to check on my house. "Everything's fine," she would assure me each time. "Your plants are thriving. Don't worry, just focus on your work." But I overlooked how she was always at my house during our calls, background noises of daily living subtly audible. Yet I was too engrossed in my work to recognize these red flags. After 3 months, the project concluded successfully, and I returned home, exhausted but satisfied with my accomplishment. Arriving after midnight, all I longed for was my bed and a hot shower. But as I tried my key, it wouldn't turn. Confused and tired, I tried again, but to no avail. As I fumbled with the lock, I heard footsteps inside. Someone was in my house. Panic rising, I was about to dial 911 when the door suddenly swung open. There, standing in my doorway as if she owned the place, was Amara, clad in pajamas, her blonde hair in a disheveled bun. Standing on my doorstep, disbelief washing over me, I confronted Amara as she nonchalantly leaned against the doorframe of my home. "What are you doing here?" I managed to whisper, the weight of her presence like a physical blow. "What am I doing here?" Amara retorted with a smug grin, her tone mocking. "Living, of course. Been here for weeks now. Daddy helped me move in while you were off, playing big-shot businesswoman in New York." My exhaustion from the travel vanished, replaced by a rising tide of anger. "This is my house," I said, my voice strained but firm. "Get out. Now." Amara flicked her gaze over her freshly manicured nails, her audacity peaking. "Yeah, that's not happening. I'm quite comfortable here. The master bathroom has amazing water pressure, by the way. Get out of my house," I demanded, each word sharp and clear. Instead of complying, Amara actually laughed, a cold, dismissive sound, and slammed the door in my face. I heard the lock click and her footsteps recede. There I was, stranded on my front porch, surrounded by my luggage, trembling with fury. The garden lights I had installed cast a soft glow on the flower beds I had so carefully tended to. Through the window, I could see into my living room, but it didn't look like mine anymore. Amara's belongings were strewn about, her jacket draped over my couch, her shoes scattered across my hardwood floors. Shaking, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mom. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy. "Bella, what's wrong? What's wrong?" I nearly shouted into the phone. "I just got home to find Amara living in my house. She says she's been here for weeks. Tell her to get out right now, or I'm calling the police." "No, don't call the police." Mom's voice shifted from sleepy to panicked. "We're coming over. Just wait there." "Where else am I supposed to go?" I snapped, frustration boiling over. I'm locked out of my own house. The next half hour was excruciating. I paced back and forth, my anxiety mounting as I watched the neighborhood slowly awaken. Cars passed slowly, their drivers likely curious or concerned about the scene unfolding. Finally, my mom's car pulled up, Gabriel at the wheel. They both rushed out, still in their pajamas under hastily thrown-on coats. "What is going on?" I demanded as soon as they approached. "Why does Amara have keys to my house? Why are you letting her live here?" Mom looked visibly uncomfortable. "Bella, honey, Amara needed a place to stay. Her lease was up and she couldn't afford the rent increase. Your house was just sitting empty." "Just sitting empty? It's my house. You had no right," I interjected, my voice rising with each word. The girl needed somewhere to live, Mom tried to justify, as if that explained everything. "Your house is too big for just one person anyway. We thought." I cut her off. "There is no we when it comes to my house. You are supposed to water my plants, not move your stepdaughter in." I searched my mother's face for any sign of understanding or remorse for the profound breach of trust. Instead, she continued making excuses for the indefensible. Gabriel then stepped forward, his posture aggressive as it had been years ago. "Look, there was no point in telling you about Amara moving in. You would have just said no." "Of course, I would have said no. It's my house," I exclaimed, the volume of my voice reflecting my outrage. "The locks needed changing anyway," Gabriel said dismissively, waving his hand. "It's done now. Amara needs a place to stay, and this house is too big for just you." "Get her out," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Get her out right now, or I'm calling the police." Gabriel's smirk twisted his features, that familiar condescension etched into his expression as he faced my ultimatum. As a teenager, I faced many challenges, but none as stark as the evening my family's true colors shone through. When my mother pleaded with me not to call the police over my stepfather and stepsister illegally occupying my house, she framed it as a pivotal moment. "If you call the police, that's it. I won't speak to you again. Do you want to destroy this family completely?" Her words echoed in the cold air, filled with tension. I couldn't help but laugh, though it was more of a bitter release than anything humorous. "This family's?" I questioned sharply. "You mean the one where your husband illegally takes over my house? That family?" Instead of answering, they turned and retreated into my home, leaving me alone on the porch, luggage in hand, as the door clicked shut firmly behind them. My hands steady and my resolve firm, I pulled out my phone. There was no more hesitation, no more attempts to preserve a peace that had never really existed. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator answered. "I need to report an illegal occupancy. Someone's changed the locks on my house and moved in without my permission," I explained. Within 15 minutes, 4 police cars arrived, their lights piercing the quiet neighborhood. The neighbors, now fully awake, peered from behind their curtains as I recounted the events to Officers Martinez and Chin. "You're the legal owners?" Officer Martinez confirmed. I showed them the property records on my phone. "Yes, I have all the documentation. I've been away on business, and I gave my mother a key to water my plants. Instead, they moved my stepsister in and changed all the locks." Officer Chin rang the doorbell. After a pause filled with shuffling sounds from inside, the door opened. There stood my mom, Gabriel, and Amara, their faces a mix of defiance and uncertainty. "Good evening," Officer Martinez began. "We need to see some identification and proof of residency from everyone. There's been a complaint." Gabriel attempted to smooth-talk his way out of the situation. "There's been a misunderstanding. Bella gave permission for Amara to stay here. They had a falling out, and now she's trying to cause trouble." "That's a lie," I interjected firmly. "I never gave permission. They took advantage while I was away on business. Ask them about the locks. They admit they changed them without my knowledge." "The old locks were faulty," Gabriel began to explain. "So, you acknowledge changing the locks without the homeowner's permission?" Officer Chin cut in, making notes on his pad. Amara, her earlier confidence fading into fear, looked toward her father. "Daddy said it would be okay. He said Bella wouldn't mind once she got used to the idea. Sir, changing locks on someone else's property and occupying their home without permission constitutes illegal entry, Officer Martinez stated, addressing Gabriel directly. We're going to have to take you and your daughter to the station. As the officers led them to the patrol cars, Amara's demeanor shrank. She appeared much younger, more like the 9-year-old girl who had first entered my life years ago. Gabriel's face was flushed with rage, yet he remained silent. My mother stood on the porch, trembling, watching as the car pulled away. When she turned to me, the hatred in her eyes was palpable. From this day forward, she said, her voice quivering, you are no longer my daughter. How could you do this to your own families? I felt an unexpected calm. Mom, I said softly, looking at her steadily, you made it clear a long time ago that they were your real family. The day Amara destroyed my research and you said nothing. The day Gabriel called me names and you excused it. This isn't new. You chose them long ago. The clarity of the moment was stark and undeniable, a long overdue acknowledgement of where we truly stood. Every time they wronged me, you asked me to be the bigger person, to tolerate their mistreatment without complaint. Time and again, you chose them, and when you drove away that night, leaving me alone with the chaos they had brought into my life, it was just another instance of your loyalty to them over your daughter. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the disarray. Amara's designer clothes draped over my chairs, her pictures stuck to my fridge, her toiletries crowding my bathroom. The next morning, I called a locksmith to change every lock in the house, sealing it off from those who had betrayed me. Later that day, the police contacted me to see if I wanted to press charges. After a heavy pause, I declined. Just make sure they know they're not welcome on my property ever again, I requested. I arranged for a cleaning service to gather all of Amara's belongings and delivered them to my mother's house. That weekend, I cleaned my house from top to bottom, scrubbing away every trace of their presence. Sadly, most of my plants had succumbed to neglect. Even my beloved bird of paradise was beyond saving. I disposed of them all and started anew. 5 months have passed since then. Mom tried to call once, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Gabriel sent an email threatening legal action for the so-called emotional distress caused to Amara, which I promptly forwarded to my attorney without a response. Amara, on her part, took to social media to vent about toxic people playing the victim, but I blocked her account swiftly. Last week, I bumped into Aunt Margot at the grocery store. She mentioned that my mom was having a hard time with our estrangement and suggested I reach out to make peace. Some bridges, I told her firmly, need to stay burned. I've been sleeping better lately. My new plants are thriving, basking in the sunlight that now floods through the clear windows. Dad and Grandma keep in touch regularly from Los Angeles, and I've even planned a trip to visit them next month. Sometimes, out of old habit, I find my hand hovering over the phone, tempted to call Mom. But then I remember that night, standing locked out on my own porch, and the impulse quickly fades.
My name is Melissa, a 30-year-old working for a foreign investment firm. I married my husband Miles 2 years ago, who works as a civil servant. However, he is not a full-time employee and has to renew his contract every year. At the end of every year, he is apprehensive about whether his contract will be renewed. Miles's family strongly believes in the superiority of public service. His parents are retired county workers, and his sister currently holds a position in the city office, so you could say they have an unwavering commitment to public service. There is some degree of disdain from them towards me as I work in a private sector firm. We have been living with Miles's family since we got married, and they tend to belittle my job every chance they get. Isn't it embarrassing to be working for a foreign company as an American? And it's an investment firm, right? Isn't that just a place obsessed with making money? His mother would often say. People who work for private companies are just those who couldn't get a public service job, and those working in foreign companies couldn't even land a job with a domestic company. They're just there because they have no other choice, she reasoned. It seems my husband, who grew up in this kind of environment, also believes public service to be superior. Even though his job isn't stable and his salary isn't high, he clings to his current unstable job. I once asked Miles when he was growing anxious around the fiscal year end, "Wouldn't you feel more secure if you became a full-time employee at a regular company rather than staying as a part-timer at public service?" To which he firmly replied, "I'd rather be unemployed than work in the private sector." Miles has not told his parents that he's a part-timer, and he insisted that I also keep it a secret. Despite having no significant position, he bragged about fictitious promotions to preserve his pride. I personally don't think he needs to lie about such things, but it seems like he wants to establish some sort of status so he can be deemed someone worthy of respect by his parents and younger sister. He never shown me his payslip, but when I saw the amount transferred into our account, it's clear that his salary is quite low. Since Miles has been promoted to section chief, his salary must have increased significantly, right? "How much is he earning now?" his father asked one evening. Caught off guard, Miles blurted out my salary instead. His father was surprised. "Is that how much one can earn nowadays?" he asked. "I don't know exactly how much a public section chief earns, but I know that my salary is quite high as a bond trader. A significant portion of my income is commission-based. Recently, I've been generating consistent profits and earning a considerably higher salary compared to an average employee." Upon hearing the figure my husband stated, his mother commented, "It's a different era, so we can't compare directly, but it seems like Miles is highly valued." She seemed quite proud. Hearing this, Miles's sister, who works at the city office, chimed in, "See, my brother, who is working at the county office, definitely earns more. He might even be at the department head level if it were the city office." This remark seemed to make Miles uncomfortable, as he had unintentionally revealed my salary. Realizing his mistake, he quickly changed the topic. "Oh, speaking of which, I saw someone from my housing manufacturer around here the other day. Are we planning to remodel this house?" he offered. Indeed, there was a salesperson from a housing manufacturer company who had visited us recently. To divert my in-laws from discussing Miles's income, I decided to help him and steered the conversation towards home improvement. "If we are considering a renovation, I'd suggest the kitchen," I added. My mother-in-law shouted at me before I could finish speaking, "Know your place as a daughter-in-law, and don't butt in on family discussions. All you need to do is keep quiet and do as you're told." It seemed that my formidable mother-in-law disliked everything I did or said. The main reason seemed to be because I wasn't a civil servant. She didn't seem to like the fact that I was receiving all of Miles's salary and giving him an allowance. Believing Miles's words that he was earning a lot of money, she had made up her mind that I was the one managing his salary. In reality, Miles's modest salary mostly went towards his personal spending, while I was shouldering almost all the living expenses. My sister-in-law didn't contribute at all to the living expenses. "Why would you take living expenses from us when we're living on a pension? Miles is making so much. You don't need it," my mother-in-law would say, showing no intention to pay. "They don't have to pay rent, and I could manage with my salary alone, but it felt unfair." I wasn't allowed to participate in the discussion about our home renovation this time, so I protested. We went to the kitchen to clean up after dinner. Neither my mother-in-law nor my sister-in-law helps with the housework, so I hurried home after work to cook, clean, and do laundry. In this respect, it was helpful to work for a foreign-owned company. As long as you performed well, you didn't have to work overtime, and you could always go home on time. I didn't bring work home either, and it was good that I could clearly separate work from private life. Miles, on the other hand, brought his work home and worked on his computer even on his days off. I was worried if it was okay for him to bring work data home in this day and age. When I asked him, he said, "I can't help it because I get yelled at if I work overtime, and even more so if I don't finish on time," and added sharply, "It's not your concern, so don't butt in." I was the one who got yelled at in return. Miles had been particularly grumpy lately and would snap at me whenever I tried to talk to him. He even yelled at me when I tried to ask about our housing issue he had been discussing with his in-laws. Just like Mom said, it's none of your business. You just need to follow what's been decided, he snapped. I was frustrated with Miles, who never told me anything while I handled the living expenses and housework. After a while, a person from the house building company came to the in-laws' house with a computer. He discussed the layout and other aspects of the house with everyone except me. When I brought them tea and tried to sneak a peek, they immediately yelled at me. "You don't need to look, just go away." I couldn't tell much from the quick glance I got, but I was surprised to see that it seemed to be a floor plan of a new house, and not a renovation plan of my in-laws' home. For some time now, my father-in-law had been saying that their house was getting cramped, and he wanted to get it rebuilt, but I didn't think he was serious. It seems that my in-laws, both of whom had quit their jobs as civil servants, received a generous retirement allowance and planned to build and live in a new house with that money. In addition to their retirement allowances, they hadn't used much of their pensions since I married into the family, so I thought they had plenty of funds. I tried not to get involved as much as possible. One thing that did bother me, though, was whether Miles's sister would still be living with us in their new home. She is now 28, and it might be time for her to get married, but I haven't heard any talk about that, so it seems highly likely she will continue living with us even in their new home. It wouldn't be a problem if she helped with the housework, but she tends to dump everything on me and then complains about it. She's as troublesome as my mother-in-law. I wish she would get married sooner, but recently I overheard my father-in-law discussing the situation with a home builder. Can we add extra rooms so that when our daughter finds a husband, they can also live here? Ideally, we'd like a house where my wife and I, our son, and our daughter and her future husband can all live together, my father-in-law concluded. I was shocked to hear this, especially as it seemed that they were planning to live with my sister-in-law even after her marriage. I can only imagine how big a house for 3 families would be. It probably wouldn't fit on our current property. Considering that they will build the house using my in-laws' retirement fund and my sister-in-law's earnings, I couldn't participate in the discussion about the house plan. Still, I can't help but think how much of a hassle cleaning will be. Then my husband and his family decided to go and visit the showcase room and construction site, while telling me to stay home. "It's none of your business," my mother-in-law shouted at me with a nasty grin, expecting a retort, and looked annoyed when I remained quiet. Construction of the new home proceeded without any information being shared with me, and my in-laws and sister-in-law started preparing to move out. My husband didn't seem to be preparing for anything, and that bothered me. "Don't you need to be getting ready to move out?" I asked. "Why would I do it? That's your job," my husband snapped back at me. I was taken aback since he didn't even tell me when and where we were moving. From then on, I started preparing for the move whenever I had time, but I made sure to separate my husband's things from mine. I'd completely lost trust in my husband from this whole new home move-out incident, and I could no longer bear my mother-in-law's terrible attitude. Even when I asked my husband about where we were moving, he just said, "You don't need to know, just be prepared." I gathered from the conversations at mealtimes that the move was approaching, but it was strange that they didn't tell me, the wife, anything. Maybe they didn't tell me because they think of me as a maid. The moving service arrived one day, and that was when I learned that we were moving. While I hurriedly tidied up the dishes from breakfast, my mother-in-law said, "We're buying new ones, so you can leave those. And are you planning to move into our new home with us?" She smirked. That was the moment I became certain that they hadn't told me about their new home or the moving date, because they intended to kick me out. Seeing my husband standing behind my mother-in-law silently grinning and saying nothing, I wondered if he had the same intentions. Well, I had anticipated something like this, so I had already prepared my things separately. Without a hint of agitation, I looked back at her. I despise everything about you. From now on, we're going to live as a family without you. Do whatever you want. My mother-in-law, looking quite displeased, shouted at me. Her daughter, my sister-in-law, watched bored, perhaps expecting me to break down and beg to stay. My mother-in-law was not pleased with my reaction. You're a parasite relying on Miles's paycheck since the day you got married. Get out now. We need Miles's salary to pay off the mortgage on our new home. Parasites like you are a nuisance, she hissed, noticeably angry, her face turning red. I had already planned on leaving, but the news of my husband's salary repaying the loan almost made me burst out laughing. My husband seemed shocked, not knowing that his salary will be used to repay the loan. He stared at his mother, then looked down, unable to tell her the truth. From his reaction, I understood that my in-laws were planning to let Miles, whom they considered a high earner, take on the mortgage repayments without using their retirement funds. The prospect of how they were going to handle the mortgage repayments became somewhat exciting to me. With a smile, I replied, "Understood. I will divorce Miles, and you can all move to your new place by yourselves." My mother-in-law, not liking my smile, seemed to want to say more, but my father-in-law and sister-in-law escorted her out of the house. I told Miles, who was left behind, "I'll bring the divorce papers, so give me the address of your new place. I have no idea what your magnificent new home looks like, so I would like to see it once," I added. He reluctantly told me the address as I spoke gleefully. With little luggage left, I had a friend help me move out using her car. I made sure to switch and have all the bills go under Miles's name from mine, utility, and everything. Returning to my parents' house for the time being, I decided to head to the address Miles had given me to have him sign the divorce papers. Their new house was impressively large, as it was meant to accommodate 3 families, and its majestic architecture was simply breathtaking. As soon as my mother-in-law spotted me, she rushed over, yelling, "What are you doing here, you parasitic wife?" Ignoring her outburst, I asked Miles to sign the divorce papers. Reluctantly, he signed them as his mother continued, "I knew it. A non-civil servant wife is useless. Sign quickly and send her away." I retorted at her, "Such a splendid new house. The payments must be a real burden, right? Can Miles's salary cover it?" Snide, I watched as she reddened once again in anger. "I don't want your business. Take the divorce papers and leave immediately," she commanded. I wanted to watch my pale-faced ex-husband a bit longer, but with his mother on the verge of exploding, I took the divorce papers and submitted them to City Hall, while starting to search for a new house. After all that had happened, I lost any desire to get married again, so I chose a studio apartment to enjoy living alone. There was a nice place near my workplace, so I moved in immediately. Without anyone to push chores on me, or anyone bragging about being a civil servant, life was peaceful. Just as I was starting to forget all about my ex-husband, I received a call from an unknown number. "Melissa, can you come back to me? I can't even make the mortgage payments, let alone electricity and water bills. My home phone and cell phone have been disconnected, and I'm calling you from my friend's phone now," my ex-husband Miles begged. Rather than relying on me, he should have asked his parents or his sister for help. "Why don't you ask your sister who works in public service to help you out? Plus, your parents must have had their retirement funds and Social Security, right?" I retorted coldly. "Actually, my parents don't have any of their retirement funds left, and my sister doesn't have any extra money, because she's also dealing with her own debt," he awkwardly admitted. Apparently, Miles's parents had fallen victim to an investment scam, losing most of their retirement funds. Miles's sister, thinking she didn't need to contribute to her parents' finances, had been buying excessively using revolving credit, resulting in her acquiring substantial debt. Hearing that I worked in investment, my mother-in-law was openly hostile. Now I wonder if it was because she had been duped by an investment scam. Moreover, perhaps out of pride in their public service job, they tried to maintain their status by purchasing luxury items. Miles's parents also had debt and were using their social security checks to make their payments. I was surprised to learn that Miles's sister, despite her youth, had been buying branded goods on credit. "Actually, I've been let go. I'm unemployed now," Miles added. He had been terminated from his job this year because he was caught working from home with the data he had taken from the office. He should have stopped when I warned him about it. It's not surprising, given he was taking confidential data out of the office. Anyway, even before Miles lost his job, his family was struggling financially without my income. Miles never told his parents that he was a part-timer. His parents also hid the fact that they lost all their retirement funds from getting scammed, and even his younger sister hid the fact that she was in great debt. Everyone in the public service family, full of ego, had a deep secret. They somehow managed when I was around, but after they moved to their new home and I left, their financial struggles became apparent. And as their last resort, Miles has now reached out to me. Of course, I had no intention of getting back with Miles, so I flat out refused and hung up. Even after that, he called repeatedly, but eventually stopped after I kept ignoring him. A while later, when I passed by their new house, I saw a for sale sign. Talking to a home builder who was there, it turned out that they couldn't pay the mortgage and had to sell it quickly, but they still had debt remaining. Gosh, that family, let me tell you, they boasted about how well off they were, but when they couldn't make their mortgage payments, they quickly sold off their place and even troubled a relative who was their co-signer, said the builder with a sigh. Apparently, when they took out the loan, they had their relatives co-sign, putting the burden on them. The word got around to all the relatives, and with their previous boast about being public servants, they're now looked down upon, particularly because the person who co-signed worked in the private sector and ended up bearing the burden. Sitting back at home, I couldn't help but smirk at the thought of how those three, shunned by their relatives and unable to brag about their public service jobs anymore, might be faring now. I'm grateful for only one thing about my husband, that I got married and met my mother-in-law. To me, she was the ideal woman. On the other hand, my father-in-law is terrible. He shows up at our rented apartment where my husband Samuel and I live and just rants and raves. He's a chauvinist, a strong believer in male superiority, and says things like, "Still no grandchildren? It must be because you're defective. Do your duty as a wife properly." His demands for a grandchild were harsh, and I was constantly berated as a worthless wife. My husband just turns a blind eye, and when I confronted him later, he made selfish excuses like, "Dad will nag me for being a henpecked husband if I defend you." Ignoring such a husband, it was my mother-in-law who protected me, saying, "Children are a blessing." Even when unfairly blamed by my father-in-law, who'd say, "It's because of your poor upbringing that Samuel turned out to be useless, just like you, who could only have him," she would just smile and say, "It's okay." I just wanted my mother-in-law to be happy, but one day she had a stroke and lost sensation in her left arm and leg. I suggested hiring a caregiver, but my father-in-law's response was cold. "If we do that, it'll seem like we're treating my wife as a burden. Plus, I'm not wasting money on her. If you feel sorry, you, as her daughter-in-law, should take care of her." Stunned by his callous words, I met Samuel's eyes, and he awkwardly asked me to quit my job and take care of his mother full-time. "Since Dad says so, and I'll help too," he added. "They are his parents, and I can't believe he is just going to help me." It was such an irresponsible statement, which meant that from the very beginning everything was put on me, the daughter-in-law. I had no intention of making life difficult for my mother-in-law, so I wrapped up my work, resigned from my job, and started the daily grind of traveling between my in-laws' place and my own home. Every time I did something, my mother-in-law would say, "Thank you," seemingly uncomfortable with how her husband treated me like a maid. He'd throw food away, saying, "I can't eat this terrible meal, dog food might be better." And when mail piled up, he'd call me over to scold me, yelling, "Managing the mail is the wife's job. Letting it pile up shows how sloppy you are." My husband, who started a consulting firm, used his irregular work hours as an excuse to ignore his mother's situation, saying, "I'm busy with work. Don't bother me." Despite the caregiving burden, the time I spent with my mother-in-law was my only solace. We talked about many things: her upbringing, how she met her husband, the struggles of married life. "We're quite alike," she'd say, confiding in me her secrets. It was then I realized she wasn't just kind, but also wise and shrewd. Sadly, a year after her caregiving started, she passed away. After the funeral, a lawyer, the executor of her will, visited along with her family. Why relatives like my grandfather and uncle, who weren't directly involved in the inheritance, were here, Samuel wondered. But the lawyer explained it was all her wish, and announced a tape recording would be played. As soon as I heard her voice, I was moved to tears, but I was shocked by her words. "I want to leave all my inheritance to my son's wife, Willow. That's my honest wish." "Why?" As if seeing through my surprise, her voice explained why she refused to leave the inheritance to her husband or son. When I became partially paralyzed and life became difficult, my husband dismissed the idea of a caregiver, ignoring Willow's pleas. He always treated her like a housekeeper and constantly shouted at her, "My son, no better than his father." He never honored his promise to help Willow, and never even came to check on me once, her voice said. My mother-in-law, tearfully, expressed her regret that I had to handle not only the demands of these two individuals, but also manage her own needs. "You need to rescue Willow from this torment, but I found immense happiness in the time we spent together. I was unable to part with her, and ultimately, I couldn't bring myself to let her go," she finished by apologizing to everyone. I could not stop my tears from welling up. The sister of my mother-in-law swiftly handed me a white handkerchief. I glanced up at her, and as I saw her tearful expression, I managed to say, "Thank you." That's when I heard, "You are a horrible man." I let out an exasperated sigh at the sound of an angry voice and a loud crash, then glanced over to see my mother-in-law's brother approaching my father-in-law, seizing him by the chest. Her family, unlike mine, was full of kind, family-oriented people. My mother-in-law's mother is gone, but her father is alive and well, crying with regret. "Why didn't she come to me for help?" he asked. I had the same question as him and had asked my mother-in-law before she died. "I'm married into another family. It wouldn't look good for a woman from a wealthy family to rely on her parents." To my surprise, she said, "But now I'm glad I endured because I got to meet you, Willow." "It's not like that," my father-in-law started to make excuses. "I merely entrusted everything to my daughter-in-law, that's all. My harsh words to her were just a way of disciplining her." My father-in-law's quivering voice broke the silence, and his unsettling noise seemed to tarnish the memory of my mother-in-law. With wet cheeks, I stood up. "My mother-in-law always protected me, both before and after she fell ill. When her food was rudely thrown away by you, she'd help me pick it up, saying her hand still worked. I don't want to hear a single word from you, father-in-law, that contradicts what my mother-in-law said," I retorted. I couldn't say more as tears welled up again. "Playing the tragic victim, huh? But weren't you really after Mom's wealth from the start?" My husband sneered mockingly and added, "Dad, you know there's something called a reserved portion, right? No matter how much Mom wanted to leave everything to Willow, half of it is supposed to be ours." he said confidently. My father-in-law seemed reassured by his son's words. Ladies and gentlemen, the will tape is not yet finished. Please return to your seats, the lawyer interjected carefully, resetting the atmosphere. I was certain of it. This should not be the only surprise left by my mother-in-law. The first words of the next tape were as I expected. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I have divorced my husband, Ezekiel, she said. Divorce from my father-in-law? I was thrilled at the wisdom of my mother-in-law to play this trump card here. People gasped in shock, and my father-in-law's eyes widened in disbelief. My mother-in-law had anticipated her son pointing out the reserved portion and legally severed ties with her husband by going through the divorce proceedings. A divorce? Impossible. When did this? My father-in-law stammered in confusion. I handed him an envelope. A divorce notice? He asked. I helped my mother-in-law to file it, I explained. What? He exclaimed. He nearly grabbed my collar, but my mother-in-law's brother protected me. You mentioned you wanted a divorce first. You said if she had the audacity to rely on her brothers while being married to a man who graciously wed a frail woman like her, she should start divorce procedures, I continued. My father-in-law, envious of his brother-in-law's prosperity and feeling powerless due to financial dependency, took out his frustrations on his own sister, my mother-in-law, to feed his own ego. I was scolded for not managing the mailbox, so I took care of the divorce notice as well. I wanted to report it, but whenever I tried, I was yelled at to be quiet, so I followed instructions, I said. That's no excuse, he yelled, red-faced, but I was praised by my mother-in-law's family, all saying, well done. With clenched teeth, my father-in-law turned to his son, Samuel. This can be fixed, right? He asked him. However, Samuel only laughed dismissively. Sorry, but there's nothing to be done. With my father-in-law's inheritance rights gone, Samuel could claim half of my mother-in-law's wealth as his reserved portion. That's impossible, my father-in-law collapsed, powerless. The rest of the will tape didn't mention any way to deprive Samuel of his share. My mother-in-law's final words on the tape were a plea to her family to look after me. The handwritten will also states the same, the lawyer added. Eventually, my father-in-law was forced out of the house. It was originally a property given to my mother-in-law by her father before marriage, and she had transferred ownership to her brother to prevent any trouble after her death. Desperate, my father-in-law ended up moving into Samuel's apartment. As for me, I had already divorced Samuel and left the apartment. I had planned to divorce anyway, but the will tape served as evidence of mistreatment, and Samuel, caring about public image, paid the requested alimony, finalizing the divorce smoothly. The financial support for my father-in-law's restaurant was cut off, and he was left scrambling for funds. Perhaps he was overworked, but it was only 3 months after I left home that my ex-husband informed me that my father-in-law had collapsed. Ironically, he had suffered the same stroke as my mother-in-law and was left paralyzed from the lower half of his body. When Samuel shamelessly asked me to care for his father, I advised him to hire a caregiver. Are you stupid? Putting him in a facility would look bad. He's my real father. Don't you have any sympathy? He retorted angrily. As his former daughter-in-law, I don't have an ounce of sympathy. If he's your real father, why don't you take care of him yourself? I snapped back, hanging up in anger. My father-in-law never had a word of gratitude for me. I wondered how it would turn out with his son, and sure enough, within a week, my ex-husband called. Apparently, he had resorted to hiring a caregiver, but my father-in-law, always finding faults and yelling, scared them all away. If I told him I would put him in a facility, he would tell my ex-husband, "You're treating me like a nuisance," and throw things at him. My ex-husband's desperate voice reached out, but I didn't deal with it, and ended the call. I eventually changed my phone number because of his persistent calls. I regretted not doing it sooner. Then, as I resumed work and enjoyed my peaceful life, it was my mother-in-law's sister who updated me on my ex-husband's situation. He had the audacity to approach my mother-in-law's family for help with his father's care. His shamelessness in asking them to care for his father and not having taken care of my mother-in-law disgusted them, both my mother-in-law's father and brother, realizing he was a man who only thought of himself, cut ties with him completely. Most of my ex-husband's consulting firm's clients were referrals from her brother, and with contracts being terminated one after another, even pouring my mother-in-law's inheritance into it wasn't enough. Eventually, his company went bankrupt. Both father and son fell from grace, unable to pay rent, and evicted from their apartment. Without funds for a caregiver, they probably live a miserable life in a cheap apartment, enduring my father-in-law's angry outbursts. My mother-in-law, who once laughed about making them regret their actions one day, would have been pleased. Just as planned, yes. I could see her smiling evilly.